Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Thursday, 22 August 2024. It is the 150th anniversary of the birth of Max Scheler, who was born in Munich on this date in 1874. Scheler is remembered as a co-founder of phenomenology, following Husserl, but also taking his own position and his own place in the phenomenological tradition. Hans Meyerhoff wrote of Scheler, quote, "Next to Husserl himself, Scheler became the most powerful mind in launching the phenomenological movement and its increasingly influential philosophical journal. The two men divided, by inclination and temperament, the world for phenomenological analysis. Husserl's chief contributions being in epistemology, logic, mathematics, and the sciences in general. Scheler's chief contributions being in ethics, religion, psychology, and sociology. In other words, the human world in general," unquote. While Scheler is noted for his ethics and his philosophy of religion, John H. Nota says in his 1969 paper, Max Scheler's Philosophy of History, that in his later period, almost all of Scheler's work was connected to philosophy of history in one way or another. And while this is true, even though most of Scheler's work was connected to history, philosophy of history in one way or another, he wrote only one essay specifically about history. But this one essay, Man in History, is remarkable, and I will discuss it further along. Since Scheler died young, at 54, what survives of his philosophy of history is fragmentary and must be reconstructed from the many books and fragments that remain. The one essay is suggestive, but it raises more questions than it answers, and it's easy to see how it might be interpreted in radically different ways. We can see this, for example, in Zachary Davis' paper of 2021, Max Scheler's Idea of History, a Juxtaposition of Phenomenology and Idealism, which argues that Scheler tried to steer a middle course between Hegelian and Marxist philosophies of history. Quote, "From the very earliest of his writings to the end of his life, Scheler attempted to chart a middle course between Hegel's idealism and Marx's historical materialism," unquote. This isn't how I would characterize Scheler's philosophy of history, but it is an illustration of the different ideas that one can take away from Scheler's views on history. I want to emphasize two themes of Scheler's historical thought, and I will argue that these two themes are interrelated. The two themes are Scheler's anti-naturalism and his interest in philosophical anthropology. One respect in which Scheler and Husserl closely agreed was their untimely non-naturalism or anti-naturalism, though the two express this idea in different ways. Marvin Farber, who was one of the first Americans to study phenomenology, has this to say of Scheler's anti-naturalism, quote, "Max Scheler was preeminent among the anti-naturalists. Similarly, his philosophical anthropology was designed to provide an alternative acceptable to fideists to the theory of the many social special sciences. He was a most determined critic of the evolutionary theory in biology as well as of its philosophical influence," unquote. Here, Farber immediately connects Scheler's anti-naturalism with his philosophical anthropology. Because of Scheler's anti-naturalism, he has to furnish a non-naturalistic philosophical anthropology in contradiction to the familiar naturalistic and scientific philosophical anthropology of his time. Philosophical anthropology hasn't gotten much traction in Anglo-American philosophy. I think a lot of Anglo-American philosophers find this to be an alien tradition, but it has been particularly influential on the continent. And of course, it has a history. Kant wrote a work on philosophical anthropology. And about the same time as Scheler was working on his philosophical anthropology, Arnold Galen and Helmut Plessner were both working on philosophical anthropologies. Galen coming from more a scientific standpoint, and Plessner coming from more of a philosophical standpoint. But in both thinkers and in Scheler as well, all of these influences, both philosophical and scientific, interpenetrate each other and are represented in all of them. Scheler was working on what was to be a large book on philosophical anthropology when he died, and we have some of the fragments and essays that would have been part of this larger project. The last book he wrote, published in 1928, the year he died, has been twice translated into English as Man's Place in Nature, as it was translated by Hans Meyerhoff, who has also edited an anthology of papers and essays on the philosophy of history that I have mentioned several times in this robe, and also as The Human Place in the Cosmos, translated by Manfred Frings, who is perhaps the most eminent of all Scheler scholars, at least those of which I know. The introduction to Frings' translation by Eugene Kelly summarizes this work, The Human Place in the Cosmos, by 4 theses, in which Scheler's alternative to naturalism is apparent, even if not yet fully formed. So these 4 theses are: the first thesis, the living body and the psyche are a unity and ascended together in a 4-step evolutionary process. The second thesis, spirit is a non-emergent and autonomous phenomenon that stands in opposition to impulsion. The third thesis, spirit pertains to the very foundation of the universe. And the fourth thesis, the role of the human being in the cosmos is the infusion of life with spirit. Kelly devotes a couple of pages to the exposition of each of these theses, and it would be reasonable to devote an essay to each of them because of their intrinsic interest and also because of their unfamiliarity. It would take about an hour probably to go through it, so I'm not going to attempt to expand on this, but the interested listener can read either or both translations and their introductions, both of which are very helpful. As I said earlier, Germanophone philosophical anthropology strikes Anglo-Americans as alien, and it takes some getting used to. It takes time to get a sense of what's going on in this tradition. The reason I'm giving emphasis to Scheler's non-naturalistic philosophical anthropology is because it is the key to his philosophy of history, or what we have in fragments and in not specifically historical works about Scheler's philosophy of history. In his essay, Man and History, which is in the collection published in English as Philosophical Perspectives, the connection between philosophical anthropology and philosophy of history is made explicit. Quote, the most important reason that so many and such different conceptions of history and sociology are in bitter struggle with each other today is that these conceptions of history are based on fundamentally different ideas of nature, structure, and the origin of man, unquote. There is here a vague resemblance to Henri Pirenne, the Belgian historian, in his view of history. Pirenne wrote, quote, all historical construction, which amounts to saying all historical narrative, rests upon a postulate, that of the eternal identity of human nature. One cannot comprehend man's actions at all unless one assumes in the beginning that their physical and moral beings have been at all periods what they are today, unquote. We could call this Pirenne's postulate. Pirenne makes human nature the center and the foundation of history, but for Pirenne, human nature is fixed and it is known. Pirenne is assuming a kind of uniformitarianism of the human sciences in the way that he frames the reliance of history on a conception of human nature, what we could also call a univocal conception of human nature. For Scheler, by contrast, human nature is a problem. It's not a unity. It's not fixed, and we need to work through it to understand what conceptions of history are based on what conceptions of man. We could say that Scheler problematizes human nature in a way that Pirenne did not. Scheler wrote, quote, the views concerning the essence and origin of man have at no other time been less sure, less determinate, and more varied than in our own, unquote. In arguing that history must be based on the kind of philosophical anthropology that he was pursuing in his last work, Man's Place in Nature, he gives a phenomenological justification for this. Scheler's philosophical anthropology would be, quote, a basic science which investigates the essence and essential constitution of man, unquote. And here we have to recall that essence and essential constitutions are terms of art in phenomenology. So philosophical anthropology is the foundation of any conception of history for Scheler. Therefore, a philosophy of history is derived from a philosophy of man. Scheler systematically follows up on this idea in his essay, Man and History. But since the essay is rather short, it suggests more than it says. And some of the subsequent discussion more explicitly lays out the relationship between a conception of man, a conception of history. Scheler distinguishes 5 fundamentally different conceptions of man. The first of these is the Christian theological conception of man, and here we are well familiar with the philosophies of history that correspond to the Christian theological conception of man. These are the philosophies of history of St. Augustine, Joachim of Fiore, Otto of Freising, and in its modern form, Jacques Benin Bossuet, among others. In many episodes, I've called these the providential philosophies of history, since they are predicated on the role of divine providence in human history. The second conception of man is that of classical Greece, and this ancient conception of man corresponds in many ways to what Oswald Spengler called Apollonian civilization. So we could call it an Apollonian conception of man, but Scheler calls this the rationalist humanist conception of man as Homo sapiens. He gives an explicit formulation of the characteristics of this conception of man in his Man in History essay. Quote, let us attach special significance to 4 particular qualifications. 1, man possesses in himself a divine agent which none of nature as such contains. 2, nevertheless, this agent and the force which eternally shapes and forms the world into the world are identical ontologically and in principle, and therefore are truly adequate for knowledge of the world. 3, as logos and as human reason, this agent is potent and able to realize its ideal content, even without the drives and senses common to them, man and animal. 4, this agent is absolutely constant, regardless of the position of the individual in history, nation, and society, unquote. So we can see that last and 4th condition or qualification pretty much is the same of what I earlier called Piren's postulate. Scheler cites Hegel as an exemplar of this view, but even as he cites Hegel, he says that Hegel abandoned the 4th of the 4 conditions, that is to say, Piren's postulate. Scheler stipulated for the rationalistic humanistic conception of man. So Scheler doesn't provide an example of a philosophy of history that perfectly reproduces the rationalistic humanistic conception of man. We could speculate that something like this conception is embodied, if only in a nascent form, in Greek historians like Herodotus, Thucydides, Polybius, and I think this would be more or less accurate. The third conception of man is the naturalistic, which Scheler calls Homo faber, or man the maker, man the fabricator, as it were. Scheler cites a great many names as representative of this naturalistic conception of man, including Hobbes and Machiavelli, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, Freud and Adler, among others. Then Scheler explicitly recognizes something that is rarely recognized in philosophy of history, and that is the possibility of a naturalistic philosophy of history based on a naturalistic conception of man. Scheler distinguishes 3 naturalistic philosophies of history. 1, an economic philosophy of history that he identifies with Marx and Marxism. 2, an ethnic philosophy of history he identifies with Gobineau and Ratzenhofer. And 3, the ideology of power politics that he identifies with Hobbes and Machiavelli. I think that there are or could be other naturalistic philosophies of history, including naturalistic philosophies of history not yet formulated, but I'm not going to elaborate on this at the moment because I think that's a big topic appropriate for another time. The fourth conception of man is that man is not to be celebrated because of his reason, not because he is Homo sapiens, but rather that man is a sick animal precisely because he is the rational animal. Scheler calls this pan-romanticism and pathogenic. Humanity, under this pessimistic conception, is intrinsically decadent and will inevitably destroy itself due to its inescapable essential nature. Here, the intellectual is fundamentally at odds with life, and so must eventually come into contact with life. So here's a little bit more from Scheler on this fourth conception of humanity. According to this terrifying pan-romanticism of a radically vitalistic theory of values, the 10,000 years of our so-called world history themselves are identical with this gradual process of destruction. Accordingly, the history of man is only the necessary decline of a species which was deathly sick from the start and was born deathly sick, a species which is in its very origins, at least in the form of Homo sapiens, of typical Occidental man, was a faux pas of life, unquote. This view of humanity is common among ideologically motivated environmentalists, among others. I've often said that the only novel political ideology to emerge in the second half of the 20th century was environmentalism, and the strength and influence of the environmentalist movement testifies to the power of its associated conception of man and the forms of history that propounds. Consider that one of the major schools in historiography that's emerged only in the late 20th century is environmental history, which is a very active area of history now, and it more or less, not in this always in this explicit form, more or less gives a history of nature in terms of this, what Scheler calls the fourth conception of man. We also have a cinematic dramatization of this conception of man in the film The Matrix, in the scene where Agent Smith is interrogating Morpheus, and Agent Smith takes out his earpiece and delivers to Morpheus an extemporaneous and vividly malicious portrait of humanity as a virus. We can also find this view in much more subtle forms, as when Stephen Jay Gould argued that our intelligence is as like as not to lead to our extinction. And this is a theme which also recurs repeatedly in the writings of Carl Sagan. The conjunction of the apocalypticism that followed the scope of planetary scale industrialized wars of the 20th century and the rise of environmental alarmism in the second half of the 20th century pushed many people in this direction, which is much more common than we might suppose. The fifth conception is recent, and Scheler identifies it with Nietzsche's figure of Zarathustra and the idea of the overman or superman, what Nietzsche called the Übermensch. This is in part a reaction against the previous idea that man is the animal that is sick in spirit. If this sickness of spirit propels us to formulate a new conception of man that overcomes this humiliation, then we have something new in history. A former friend of mine once gave a one-sentence summary of Nietzsche that the overman is the man who has overcome the human all too human. And this is as good a summary of Nietzsche as I have ever heard, so I often repeat it. Scheler argues that this Nietzschean conception of man has been further developed in the value ethics of Dietrich Heinrich Kerler and Nikolai Hartmann. Hartmann's book on ethics has been translated into English, but it's not widely known. And like the tradition of philosophical anthropology, it often strikes Anglo-American readers as an alien tradition. Scheler identified Kurt Breisig and the circle around Stefan George as working out the historical consequences and implications of this conception of man for history, but he doesn't give us an example of a philosophy of history that follows from this conception of man. But he does say at the end of this essay, quote, history based on this anthropology becomes a monumental presentation of the spiritual figure of heroes and geniuses, or to adopt Nietzsche's terms, of the highest examples of the human species, unquote. Scheler explicitly tells us that none of these 5 conceptions of man that he has outlined in this essay, or their associated conceptions of history, correspond to his own conception of man or his conception of history. He was only trying to sort things out, and he was still to write, or still hoped to write, his own definitive philosophical anthropology. And by the principles of his own thought, a distinct conception of history would follow from this distinct philosophical anthropology that he never wrote the definitive version, but we have this fragment of man's place in nature. In some ways, the last of the 5 conceptions of man outlined by Scheler is closest to his own views, but his conception of man is, the conception of man in this 5th conception is deeply Nietzschean. And as I will discuss in a moment, there are important differences between Nietzsche and Scheler, so that despite the obvious influence of Nietzsche upon Scheler, in some respects, the two are opposite numbers, philosophically speaking. Of this last of the 5 conceptions of man, Scheler mentions in passing its, quote, historical and categorical personalism of being and values, unquote. And I think this typifies Scheler's view, even if the rest of the 5th conception does not. If I had to put a label on Scheler's philosophy of history, I might call it a personalistic Hegelianism. But even as I say that, I know it's wrong and I know it would be misinterpreted. There are some senses in which the overall structure of Scheler's philosophy of history is similar to Hegel, but instead of history converging on absolute knowledge and absolute spirit, as in Hegel, history is converging on Scheler's conception of humanity. But Scheler's conception of humanity isn't descriptive, rather it is prescriptive. Scheler sees what he believes humanity can become, and it is this that is the end and aim of history for Scheler. Some of what Scheler sees as the possibility for humanity are discussed in his essay, Man in the Era of Adjustment, which is also translated in the volume Philosophical Perspectives. And it's worth reading for the light it sheds on Scheler's conception of man, but I'm not going to discuss this today. Much of this also resembles some of the themes in Husserl's philosophy of history, not surprising. As I had mentioned earlier, the relationship between Husserl and Scheler, both in terms of the origins and development of phenomenology, as well as their shared anti-naturalism. Husserl, near the end of his life, gave 2 talks that are now commonly known as the Vienna Lecture and the Prague Lecture. He gave a talk in Vienna in 1935 titled Philosophy and the Crisis of European Humanity. And later the same year, he gave a talk in Prague titled The Crisis of European Sciences and Psychology. The material of these 2 lectures was worked into a longer book published posthumously under the title The Crises of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology. And it is this book and the talks that it was based on that constitutes Husserl's philosophy of history. These essays by Husserl were conceived and presented on the eve of the Second World War in the late 1930s, which the poet W.H. Auden called a low, dishonest decade. But Husserl still had hope for the future. He saw the storm clouds on the horizon, and he argued forcefully for the renewal of European humanity in spite of these storm clouds, that there was a problem coming, but we could transcend that, you could say. Scheler also gave us 2 essays on what we could call the crisis of European humanity. The last section of his book on philosophy of religion, On the Eternal in Man, is titled The Reconstruction of European Culture, and it consists of 2 parts: the political framework and moral conditions of cultural reconstructions in Europe, and the formative powers available for the spiritual renewal of Europe. So you can see how close those themes are to the themes of the late Husserl. but they are conceived under very different circumstances. There's a note on the first of these two that it was delivered as a lecture in the fall of 1917, and both of these essays read like lectures. So although Husserl and Scheler each wrote 2 essays on the spiritual renewal of Europe, Husserl's were presented on the eve of the Second World War, while Scheler's were presented as the First World War was still being fought. So like I said, under very different historical conditions. And these 2 pair of essays perfectly reflect the earlier quote from Hans Meyerhoff about how Husserl and Scheler divided the world between them for phenomenological analysis. Husserl's vision of the renewal of humanity was informed by an ideal of science, albeit an anti-naturalistic science, and the infinitistic pursuit of knowledge that vaguely resembles Hegel's pursuit of absolute knowledge. Husserl didn't call it absolute knowledge, though. This is what we could call an epistemological vision of ideal humanity. Scheler's vision of the renewal of humanity was much more political, social, and cultural. For lack of a better way of describing it, I could call it a human vision of the renewal of humanity, and I expect that Scheler's vision is much more approachable than that of Husserl. I could also evoke Nietzsche in this context and say that Scheler's conception is a human, all too human vision of humanity. Nietzsche was a significant influence on Scheler. And in fact, Scheler wrote a book on Nietzsche's conception of ressentiment, which is a key concept in Nietzsche's ethics. Scheler tries to turn the table on Nietzsche when it comes to ressentiment. He argues that Nietzsche himself, in particular in regard to Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity, was motivated by ressentiment, that is to say, motivated by repressed hatred, envy, resentment, and desire for revenge. Nietzsche had argued that with ressentiment, the negative emotions reach such a pitch of development that they create new values. And Nietzsche said that Christian love was the finest flower of ressentiment. Scheler accepted much of Nietzsche's analysis of ressentiment, and he even said of it, quote, "Among the scanty discoveries which have been made in recent times about the origins of moral judgments, Friedrich Nietzsche's discovery that ressentiment can be the source of such value judgments is the most profound," unquote. But for Scheler, Nietzsche's rejection of Christianity and Christian love was a result of Nietzsche's repressed hatred, envy, and resentment toward Christianity. Scheler's Christianity and his conception of love were important aspects of his life and his philosophy. In Scheler's essay, Ordo Amoris, which could be translated as The Order of Love, we find the intersection of his ethical and historical interests expressed. Quote, "It belongs to the essence of that objective realm of values that the realm of that which is worthy of love can be mentally represented only in a limitless profusion of different types of spiritual individuals, and within the domain of human spirits, only through different singular and collective individuals, families, peoples, nations, and cultural circles of unequal value. Only because we represent that realm in this way can we know the things and events which are bearers of what is worthy of love and put them into effect. Similarly, it is the essence of this realm that it is exhibited over the course of time in the form of a unique ethical history," unquote. When Scheler wrote this, the idea of an ethical history might have seemed a bit strange, but retrospectively, we can understand Nietzsche's genealogy of morals as a moral history, perhaps the first moral history, though there are hints of a moral history to be found in Gobineau, I would argue. Since that time, we also have Foucault's many genealogies, and although Foucault genealogies aren't explicitly ethics, we might even say that Foucault, to a certain extent, eschews ethics. They can't avoid touching on ethical themes. I would even say pervasively touching on ethical themes. In the passage I quoted, Scheler says that there are objects of love of unequal value, And this is, of course, implied by the very idea of an order of love, which could also be called a hierarchy of love, or rather, a hierarchy of loves. Scheler continued on love, quote, "The unique collective destiny of the individual mankind can be fulfilled only when this exhibition reaches completion in a simultaneous social and successive historical conjunction, bringing together love within the various regions of value ordered in accordance with the Ordo Amoris. It is only when loving is restricted to one part of what the subject is essential capable of attaining that we have a case of confusion. The ultimate cause of confusion here is one of the types of infatuation. To this extent, there is guilty emptiness of love in the human heart. This can be individually assumed as well as ancestrally and communally assumed guilt. It can be as much tragically and fatefully assumed as, in the common sense of the world, freely assumed guilt," unquote. If you're getting religious vibes off this quote, you're not alone. The third of the theological virtues, after faith and hope, is, after all, charity, which is also identified as love. So we can say faith, hope, and charity, or faith, hope, and love as the theological virtues. Scheler's essay on love could also be understood as an exposition and an analysis, thus, of one of the classic theological virtues, but he contextualizes this exposition of love in a traditional theological virtue in a phenomenological inquiry into an ethics of values. In addition to his book on the philosophy of religion, Scheler, on the eternal in man, mentioned earlier, Scheler wrote a book on ethics, Formalism in Ethics and a Non-Formal Ethics of Values. Scheler was one of the most important figures bringing value ethics or axiology to philosophical prominence. Even today, even corporations publish explicit statements of their corporate values, but this is a very recent historical development that I think we can trace to the 19th century, or not much more before the 19th century. Nietzsche was the first major philosopher to explicitly frame ethical problems in terms of values, and this tradition has only grown since Nietzsche's time. Scheler was one of the agents of the growth of axiology and value ethics. This is the aspect of Scheler's thought that has influenced me most personally. Near the beginning of Formalism in Ethics, Scheler wrote, quote, "There is a genuine increase of value in the real world with any new good," unquote. This is one of the guiding ideas of Scheler's thought, and of mine as well, I could say. Nietzsche's idea that ressentiment creates new values gives us the other side of the coin, and it shows us that the value of the world doesn't always increase as a consequence of axiological innovation. We can see ressentiment and the values that cluster around ressentiment is an axiological innovation, but it doesn't necessarily, it enriches the world qualitatively, but you might say that it doesn't necessarily enrich the world ethically or morally, although that's an interesting question that would require a great deal of further exposition. So although Scheler located the source of philosophies of history and philosophies of man, his conception of a philosophy of man is pervasively religious and moral. I can't remember where I read this. I think it was Walter Kaufmann writing about Paul Tillich, but it has been argued that Scheler was the ultimate source of the familiar idea that human beings don't have a choice of whether or not they're going to be religious, only whether they're going to worship God or an idol. That is to say, whether they're going to worship something that is an appropriate object of worship or an inappropriate object of worship. But in the end, human beings are going to worship. This idea was popularized in the second half of the 20th century by Paul Tillich, who was a very famous Protestant theologian, but you can already find it pretty clearly expressed in Scheler. I suspect that Nietzsche would have ridiculed this argument, as he would have ridiculed Scheler's attempt to turn the table on him, or he would have turned the table back again on Scheler and repurposed Scheler's criticisms and arguments to further his own project. In this way, Nietzsche and Scheler represent fundamentally different temperaments and fundamentally different approaches, both to man and history. Nietzsche didn't write a philosophical anthropology, but if he had, it would have been very nearly antithetical to Scheler's philosophical anthropology. So happy birthday, Max Scheler, and thanks for listening.